I'm not sure.
Well, when you read the New York Times, read our local paper, you're really people walking.
6:54. Right. I don't think we do it.
Hopefully it records and does everything.
No?
I don't know if anybody wants to go back and watch it.
Of course, this is the highlight of the year.
Oh, well, I'm here.
It was first played in 1600.
I know, I'm excited.
Wow.
It sounds like there's a weekend then.
Wow. What a nice memory.
I finally got to visit it.
Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 75.
Oh, she knows.
Yeah, 40 years.
81.
I think
He had a year or two on.
Yeah, just a year or two.
Okay, yeah.
I think I have.
Yeah.
Well, then I'm ready to see.
How are you?
I do.
You're looking great. You're one of those guys that keep looking younger.
My hips don't feel any younger.
Hi
there.
I gotta give you a hug. I haven't seen you. Your whole office, everything's gone.
I know. You drop by and look, huh?
Yeah.
And the orthopedic, did you see the look inside the orthopedic surgeon has the prop?
Yeah, it's hand surgery, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no pictures on the wall.
Needs to figure that out.
Well, now that it's off season, what do you do with your spare time?
Running. I'm trying to stay in shape in the off season. I'm in running. Yeah. So I live in Upper Queen, so I run like a 4-mile loop around Harrisburg. Or I go through Harrisburg. Yeah. Yeah, I try to sprint up the hills.
I avoid hills. I live on the east side and I run over the San
To show my, if you measure enough stuff, you can find a statistical,
I do the basic here and there.
statistical benefit from everything.
How about getting another shingles shot?
You already got one already. Oh, the Shingrix is way better than the rest.
Yes.
There's so much to distract you.
I've never had it.
And in the fall. I mean,
Well,
it's just like a
Restaurant.
Oh, that's the suspects.
Where do you live?
5 years ago.
Having fun.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Got plenty to do. I've been doing mini travels. I was going skiing in Colorado.
Oh, how fun.
Southern California for a week.
It's a way better vaccine. What is it called? Shingrix. Yeah.
And then I was going to take we're going to take it out this summer. And so I was like, I've got a septic tank. And
Anyway,
I was
that's
going to try to
Yeah.
do so. And of course, my back was sore for a week after that.
Can you sleep on the
Well, but it's only two in the right thing. But it's only three and a half.
There's usually 4 of us, my sister, my husband, and our dogs.
Oh, cute. Okay, so you can take it out to like Harbor or something.
This is going to be on a 10-day trip. It's a little tired.
Yeah.
I have a
You asked me if it's part of our You have no idea. I feel like you're
When
completely
it's the pro.
San Juan's are beautiful.
yeah.
Both islands, of course, between that and Vancouver Island. Same country.
Yeah. It's gorgeous. I need to test and get myself about.
You can lose a lot of money. You know, I had rent.
Need to win the lottery first, right?
I know.
Like about 2 hours. She's got to take a board. I only got enough hours of experience.
You have it on your iPad. I don't have it. So
This year, the
Plans or
flu vaccine has another
I'll give it to you.
I bet you everyone is.
And what surprises me is none of the viral vaccines do they give a single vaccine. They'll give them all.
You need like 12 on the side.
And they wonder why it's only 38%.
Oh, I think you guys have it.
you know, he's telling me you don't know. That's what he's saying.
The second
You don't know.
So what's the vaccine? just needs
Oh, that's the middle
the
piece.
second shot's about 75%.
Yeah, it gets small.
In a couple of years. So, you know, the way it was figured out was just
Yeah,
cheaper.
I'm
Oh,
thinking about that. I don't know. For the board. I can't
trying to
like
get up those giant the only way otherwise.
Shingles, now that they're getting a little bit more handle on it, that's a 2-shot vaccine like Zostovax. But if you take it for 100%,
We told Link you.
How about Black Friday? Do you make sell something?
2 shots, but it gives you 10
We
years.
told Black Friday.
100% versus 5 years.
My mom sells hearing aids because like after.
Right, and you'll probably get a better response from shingles because you already have some.
You have it as a second, right?
So the DeVito is still,
You have it as a
yeah, they'll tell you when you get your second.
like a nice
So you get the first one and then you
Most
come
of
back.
them, all the security, everyone
So it's like
they have them on.
How much have you get? And it's the
I'll get it to you, Tom. Don't worry.
So.
We actually stopped buying Zostovax and just use a whole
This thing scares me.
From the other side.
All right, let's go ahead and.
for good reason.
And the street grows louder
And all the fellows came. And Jay actually in Drew's absence got everything set up and running. So I hope the outside audience.
You only got him to blame.
Yeah,
Well, I don't know. See, I'll get a text on my phone if there's some broadcast problem. The only real announcement I have this morning before Gary starts his history tour is the last session of the year I sent out for you to vote whether to have it Monday the 21st or Tuesday the 22nd. And the vast majority of people picked the 22nd on Tuesday. So I know there are a couple of people who just said they couldn't attend that day, but they can't please everybody all the time. So it's going to be Tuesday the 22nd at the Italian restaurant Rigoletto over here in South Lake Union. I'm working on getting parking, so parking, even though it's in the evening, still shouldn't be a hassle. I'm not saying it's free parking, but find a place to park. And I'm negotiating with the restaurant so that the guy just closes the entire place for the evening, so we have the whole place to ourselves, and hopefully enough room for the classical tricycle racing. Last year, as I remember, Mike Kennedy fell on his face during the tricycle racing.
I recovered though.
All right, so Gary
Isn't there a lawsuit
changed his
pending about
topic.
that?
I had given him political systems in the U.S. and around the world. He thought that was way too explosive a topic to handle in today's.
Especially after last night.
Yeah, well, every day is last night with this guy. I'm not supposed to say things like this from this website.
What are they gonna do,
Say
Len?
whatever
Fire
you
you?
want.
That'd be good. So Gary is gonna, I don't know what he's gonna do
I don't know
exactly.
what I'm going to do either. You know, over the years I've been doing these talks, and Len has always given me unusual topics, and over the years, and it's hard to believe that after 35 years, I'm finally coming to my swan song at the end now because I just started my retirement last month.
Hey.
All right. But anyhow, I'm just going to recapitulate some of the highlights and mostly lowlights of 35 years of Journal Club presentation. I did want to dedicate this to Len. Gosh, the guy's been incredible for this organization and for all the community allergists through all these years and all the hard work. And he doesn't get paid a whole bunch. He gets a little under the table, but he's going through all this. And ironically, there's no question that the Journal Club should be named after him. I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a bit because he has made it his baby and it's been fabulous over the years. Anyhow, this is dedicated to him as well as to any of you out there, or all of you that have gone through this, especially the old timers, you know, Mike and Paul and Al and Nick, and sat through these over the years. I'm going to review the topics that I've done very briefly and go over the highlights and the lowlights. Now, everybody that knows when I give these presentations, this bugs me that we have to do this. The Gestapo tells us you have to have a mandatory disclosure slide. So this is mine and my mini protest. I think we should be responsible enough. We shouldn't need to worry about that. Or if there is a conflict, you should say it on your own. You shouldn't be coerced.
Where's your assault rifle? Do you have it down with you?
Like I said, this is my swan song, or last, or in the case of my age, maybe the last gasp. So.
You think I'm not going to assign you a topic next year?
Probably assign me. I'm not so sure I'll do it. But anyhow, it is work. You know, and I commend everybody that gives a talk here, because it takes a lot of time and effort, and which is, you know, again, a labor of love. Now, the Journal Club for the youngsters in the room, it was named after Paul Van Arsdale, who was the first head of the allergy division at the University of Washington. This is a picture of him. He was on the faculty from 1954 to 94, and he was obviously very important. He trained almost all of the NAC people, Orrin Bierman and Pearson, Shapiro, Furukawa. He also trained two of my partners, Rick Johnson and Jim Stroh, so he's a very important man. He was a gentle soul. He was an Anglophile. He would have loved to have been British, and he smoked a pipe. Ironically, that may have been part of his demise. Over the last 5 years of his life, he was fighting pharyngeal cancer, and he was a pipe smoker, probably had something to do with it. The one sobering fact is when he died at the age of 67, he was younger than me. You know, at my age, I look at the obituaries every Sunday. So.
You know, as I think about it now, he smoked the pipe in the health sciences building in his office.
Well, I remember having pipe in his mouth. I don't remember
Maybe
so
it
much
wasn't
smoke,
his.
but he had it in his mouth a lot of the time. I just about everybody here had the opportunity to meet him, except these youngsters. Okay. All right. Anyhow, when I came here in 1980 to start a fellowship, the junior faculty members, and I wish I had pictures from those days, were right there, Bill and Len. And in 1980, Drew is on the faculty now, and that's what he looked like. This was one of Len's first fellows. And I don't know who he is, but he's awfully good looking. Anyhow, just a little background, 1980, what was going on. Just a little history. The top songs were Lady by Kenny Rogers, another one, Bites the Dust by Queen, and Sailing by Christopher Cross. The top TV shows were All in the Family, Dallas, the Dukes of Hazzard, Mount St. Helens erupted. It was also the time of the Iranian hostage crisis, which ended in January of '81. John Lennon was shot. The #1 movie was The Empire Strikes Back. Here's a picture of the #1 car, the Oldsmobile Cutlass. Of course, they don't make Oldsmobiles anymore. And my salary as a fellow was $17,000 a year. How much you guys get?
65.
85?
65.
Oh, 65, okay. Anyhow, as I was talking about, Len signed the topics, and I took a little literary license here and there, and I would change them slightly. I changed them drastically this year. You better be nice to me, or I'll be a little bit like this clown here. This is Larry Larson. I was very disappointed when he stopped making cartoons. And he says, "Laugh at me, will they?" Anyhow, the very first talk I gave is one of the ones I've used ever since, as well as the second one, skin testing for penicillin allergy and contact dermatitis. Anyhow, you can go down to 1988, and that was the first of the non-straight allergy topics that I did, the new physics. I got down to oncogenes, but that's somewhat related. Going down the next list over the years, I had exercise physiology, still medical, but then stargazing for the allergist, so you could go and look at this night sky and identify the constellations. Especially got off track with winemaking, and the health benefits of wine. Oh, the last one there, the Vinci Code, the popular book. At any rate, I'm going to go over some of these in a short summary. Now, as everybody knows that listens to my talks, I always force you to do a Jeopardy-type quiz at the end to try to make you pay attention to my talks when it's incredibly difficult to do so because of the boredom. But at any rate, I will be throwing a few in here just to keep you guys honest. Actually, the first one was penicillin skin testing, and it's amazing how things haven't changed significantly at all since that time. Back then, you had the major determinant commercially. You made your own minor determinants. You made diluted penicillin, and we used to keep old penicillin. Did you guys do that too? Thinking that maybe it would degrade to some of the minor determinants. I don't know whether that's true or not. So, and we would prick test with those. We did intradermal testing, and we gave a dose of the amoxicillin. And guess what? That's exactly what they do today. There was a brief time when the minor determinants were commercially available. Remember, there was about 3 or 4 years, but the FDA took them away. So, at any rate, so that has not changed much. Again, contact dermatitis was a topic. I learned a lot because we didn't get taught a lot during our fellowship about that. I actually gave this talk to the dermatology fellows as well. Back then, you got the skin testing for polisher steroids. They're actually only about 16, 17. They didn't have the true tests like we do now, which is what is commonly used. Now, here's my first quiz for you. See if you can remember this stuff. Okay, it's best match, left versus right. Remember what ethylene diamine is in?
Hair dye.
No. It's in Mycolog cream. The paraphenylene diamine is the hair dye. Anyhow, it's used in making Mycolog. Does anybody remember what Mycolog cream is? You know what it is? It's nystatin and triamcinolone. Anyhow, Thiaram, of course, is in rubber, but it is also in antabuse, the drug. So people can get systemic contact dermatitis from antabuse because of the Thiaram molecule, which is a rubber accelerator. Pyrethrins is an insecticide. You know, I don't see people getting contact dermatitis do that very often. Maybe it's not used. For nickel, you could do the dimethylgloxamine test. Remember that? Where you could, it would react to make the nickel turn red. So if somebody brought in some jewelry and you want to know if they had nickel in it, you could test it. Paraphenylene diamine is the hair dye. Where are the chromates in? Remember? Cement, right, Mike. Frulania. It's an occupational hazard of people who work in the woods because it's a liverwort that lives on the bark of trees, and people would get contact dermatitis.
I thought that was a country that bordered Liechtenstein.
Now, this is when I've seen a couple of cases. So there's a urushiol-like substance, in other words, like poison ivy, in cashews, and you can get a systemic contact dermatitis in cashews. So they get a delayed reaction to eating cashews, and I've seen a couple of cases like that over the years.
Isn't it mostly on the shell, though? It doesn't often come on the nut part.
You know what? I'm not positive about that. That may be the case. Anyhow, benzocaine was a nupercanol, a topical steroid, and sesquiterpene lactones. Actually, that would be a board question. Is a resin in plants like ragweed, and it's caused contact dermatitis, and chrysanthemums. Okay, you guys did really well. I'm giving you that. Anyhow, back then, one of my talks in 1985 was on insulin and reaction to insulin. It was a much bigger deal then. Again, the young guys probably don't know that, but our insulin back at that time was from pork and cows.
Are these your original slides from these talks?
No, I'll tell you what, I had to cheat. You know, I didn't PowerPoint. I think the first one was 2004. So I had to go back and improvise here. So, yeah.
What did you do before that?
We had typed it out. Remember typewriters? And we just had handouts and basically about no pictures or anything like that. But that's the way it used to be. And we used to just sit around a round table in the cafeteria over at the University of Washington. And everybody had their own handout and they'd be looking at it. There was no projectors and all that back in the old days. Originally, we did mostly, we started out mostly journals, but then it evolved. Obviously, the community allergists giving topics, and then Len, of course, has made this into an international phenomenon by getting outside speakers flown in from all over the world. So, anyhow, they had cow and pig insulin, and the insulin molecules were slightly different, a few amino acids different. In 1982, Humulin came out, but it probably took another 10 years before the animal-based ones were phased out. So we did see more reactions at that time, and it was a more important issue. You can get allergic reaction to Humulin as well, but it's rare. Now, on March 4th, 1985, Len and I and the people in the lab went down for a coffee break. All of a sudden, the fire alarm goes off, and you go outside, and there are literally thousands of people outside. And we look up at the top of the health sciences building, and there's fire coming out of the top of it. And we're thinking, no, those poor suckers whose lab is burning, wouldn't that be terrible? And we started looking, and there were 16 floors. We counted down 3. Well, 13th, that's our floor. We finally deduced that it was actually our office going up. And actually, I think it was Gary Peterman was working with us then. He lost a whole bunch of research. We didn't lose that much, but it can be catastrophic if you got your information there. You didn't lose any, did you, Bill? It was.
It wiped out my lab too.
Oh, yeah,
Because the flames went over 2 rooms.
I didn't know that. Well, I went back and I was trying to find information. This is the official press release on this. And I don't know who they interviewed to get this information, maybe Linda. A major fire occurred on the 13th floor of the Health Sciences BB. It started in a fume hood when a Bunsen burner caught a rubber tube on fire, then spread outside the fume hood. The lab technician was unable to turn off the gas. Do you know who that was? You know, we were all looking at each other. Did you leave the Bunsen burner on? They didn't know, but anyhow, they interviewed somebody who said that we're unable to turn off the Bunsen burner. Anyhow, it said the 4 adjacent rooms, and obviously Bill's room, suffered major fire and smoke, and I didn't realize it spread out that much. It was so hot it melted Pyrex. So impressive. So
Pretty hot.
If you look at the front of the Health Sciences building, still to this day,
It still has a
from the
side
street,
pane.
there are panels up at the very top, and the cleanest panel is the one where the fire was, because after everything was fixed, there was so much smoke damage that it poured out the windows that they came and cleaned that section of the exterior. And all these years later, you can see it's clean, and the other sections have more external soot just from pollution.
Next topic in 1987 was controversies and allergies. We certainly have plenty of that, but they persist to the present. I wasn't sure the fellows even learned about wrinkle injection therapy. Are you guys familiar with that? Maybe it's so far gone, but it's still being done now by older ENT allergists. Basically what they do is they keep injecting with higher concentrations. Now there is some correlation with allergies because they could have IgE response, but most of the time they get injected such high concentration they get irritant reactions. Then they say the person's allergic, and then it was totally arbitrary. You either give them 50 times the dose to neutralize it or 150 if it was just, but it's still out there and you may come across it. Provocative food challenge. They used to basically, it's like homeopathy. They put some stuff over the tongue, say, are you having any symptoms? And then they neutralize it by homeopathic techniques. I think only the oldest people in the room are going to remember cytotoxic testing. They used to take the person's white cells and then put different things that they thought they might react with chemicals and see if the white cells clumped. Remember that? Anyhow. But there were a whole bunch of other things. Multiple chemical sensitivity was a hot topic. The yeast connection, you guys familiar with the yeast connection? It was written by a book by a guy's name was Crook. Hey, you guys aren't going to pass your boards, you don't know this stuff.
You better hope there's no history section.
all these bogus techniques.
It's all this bogus
that
stuff.
used to plague our specialty, and to some extent, have not gone away.
And some of us, and there were some of us guilty of it. Some allergists that did this stuff. And in fact, I jumped to the very last one. In the old days, and my partners used to do it, they made bacterial vaccines where they culture the person's throat and make a vaccine from it. And the principle's not bad, but the science wasn't there. And so there were allergists in the community when I first started that were still doing that. Anyhow, this is when he gave me, Len gave me a topic way off the beaten path. And it was the new physics. I was very interested in relativity and quantum mechanics and all that. And that was basically a talk for that for the allergists. And so over the years, about every 5 to 10 years, I would redo this subject because I guess Len was a glutton for punishment. I guess that's why. Anyhow. Now, this is an interesting topic, psychoneuroimmunology. We haven't had that one since, I don't believe. And basically, we all know that people that have significant stress in their lives are more prone to having physical ailments as a result. And actually, a lot of the studies were done here at the University of Washington. A guy by the name of Holmes, was here, and he did research actually with Van Arsdale. And the research with Van Arsdale, not surprisingly, showed that people who were under stress had worse asthma, which isn't very surprising. But they said, well, psychologically has an effect on the immune system. And so it's easy to do immunologic studies to measure T cells and B cells and all that. To be honest with you, there's very little evidence that the immunologic properties of the individuals with stress was changed much. They did show, I think, right down at the bottom, they have decreased natural killer cell function for what it's worth. I really do think that probably most of it is related to psychological issues. Hey, these people get depressed, they take drugs, they commit suicide, and the stress hormones, I think, no question, they have increased risk of heart attacks and strokes. In fact, there was a recent article just this week in JAMA, and it was the association of negative wealth shock with all-cause mortality. And if you lose a lot of money fast, your risk of death over the next 2 years is 2 times higher than somebody who doesn't have wealth shock. Oncogenes in 1991, and that's something we probably should update. That was brand new stuff back then, and of course, it discussed the fact that the oncogenes are activated cells that have normal function in the cell growth and cell transcription cycle, but there were also tumor suppressor genes around to prevent cancers from developing, and if you have mutations in those genes, you could also get an increased risk of cancer. This down on the left, do I have a pointer?
Is there a mouse there, or?
Is it up there? Anyhow, on the far side, on the proto-oncogene, just shows all the genes that are associated with normal growth pathway, growth factors, the receptors, the signaling enzymes, and all that. It doesn't show it in detail. If you go over to the right, it gets into all the specifics, PDGF, EGF, RAS, RAF, BCL2, all those things that you guys understand, and I have the foggiest idea what it's about. But essentially, everyone with a mutation of those has been associated with cancers. Now, the next topic I did was a self-serving one. I wrote a chapter for a book that was edited by Montanaro and Bardana on biologic agents and indoor air pollution. Got that big slide from the book. I was only involved with the mold and bacteria up here on the right-hand side, and most of what I wrote in there was about hypersensitivity syndromes due to molds and organic toxic dust syndrome, things of that nature. I did talk about some of the infectious disease issues, somewhat unique in the workplace or potentially such as Legionnaires. Now, I don't know, I didn't tell the people here, I actually did infectious disease fellowship before I did allergy. So the first couple of years, I didn't start doing journal club till '83 because I was doing infectious disease. So Len had me do this topic on the new infectious agents, and it is fascinating, all the new things that have come along just in our lifetime, these new bugs that cause significant illness. For example, and this is from 1987 to 92 when I gave the talk, Ebola was new, hantavirus, of course, down in the Four Corners area. Legionnaires, 1976 at a Legionnaires convention in Philadelphia, an outbreak of a whole bunch of COPD people dying. Campylobacter diarrhea. In 1980, the first retrovirus causing infections in humans was found. And of course, that led up to HIV being found in '83. But Lyme disease was finally defined in 1982, so not that much later. The fact that Helicobacter contributed to gastric ulcers was mind-blowing to me. That we had a bacteria that caused that. That was an incredible surprise. Going down the list, hepatitis C. We knew that there were chronic hepatitis. We didn't know the bug. And it wasn't until 1989 that we
non-A, non-B hepatitis. Right?
Yeah, we called it non-A, non-B. And it was out there. We didn't know what it was, but they finally found it. Ehrlichiosis, cat scratch fevers due to Bartonella. Anyhow, just exciting times for infectious disease. Now, the next topic was gamma delta T cells. And again, back at that time, they had very little idea what was going on. This is an updated slide that I downloaded. They know a lot about it now. I still can't say I know much about it. Do you guys know anything about gamma delta T cells? No, Bill, being modest, he probably does. But there are a couple of things. It sounds like it's somewhere between the innate and the adaptive immune system, something in between from an evolutionary point of view. They don't. The T cells with those receptors don't require antigen processing, and they don't require MHC peptide epitopes to be presented. And they tend to react more to lipid antigen. You can see I read that because I don't know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, they come a long ways, and then maybe it's time to do that topic again. IgE receptors, I did. There was no question about the high affinity and binding to Th2 cells and leading to the production of IgE that causes the degranulation of mast cells and basal. The question was, what was the CD23, the low affinity receptor's function? Any of you know? It isn't that. It isn't. CD23 enhances antigen presentation by B cells to T cells, which increases IgE. So it is a feedback in the feedback loop in a positive way to increase IgE production, but it's different than the high affinity one. I had a talk on the so-called Dutch hypothesis. You may be familiar with that term, that COPD and asthma are a continuum and they're the same disease. I'm not a believer of that. I'm a believer in the British hypothesis, is that they are different diseases. What confuses the issue is that a lot of people with COPD have some reversibility, but most of that is small time. A lot of it reflects if you have very low lung volumes and you go up only 2 or 3%, it looks like a lot of reversibility just because of the mathematics. the denominator is so small that everything looks larger, and I think that has a lot to make it look like COPD is reversible. But clearly the inflammatory cells on the right side here are different, where you have for asthma, especially allergic asthma, but also non-allergic asthma, eosinophils and mast cells play a major role, whereas in COPD it's mostly neutrophils and macrophages, and you get destruction of tissue, not so much the bronchial constriction. 1997 was fungal sinusitis, and the major reason I think I was giving this talk is because that was a time when allergic fungal sinusitis was a hot topic, just like ABPA. Now we realize the same phenomena happened in sinuses. Obviously, there's invasive fungal sinusitis, which is almost purely in the immunocompromised. It talks about the different presentations, and the so-called non-invasive, and the major one being allergic fungal sinusitis. People can have fungus balls too. The only way to make this diagnosis with any certainty is you have to biopsy and get tissue. But coming back to allergic fungal sinusitis, I admit we just don't see it here. In the Midwest, apparently it's common. I don't know that I've ever seen a case. Have you seen one?
No, but remember the Mayo Clinic had the only test that could prove it? You had to send your patients there. What was the guy's name? I don't remember. Nobody else could do the test. Yeah. It had to be the Mayo Clinic.
Or something like that. Yeah. Yes. But the upshot was it was different organisms. Obviously, we focused on Aspergillus, but actually in allergic fungal sinusitis, bipolaris, curvularia, alternaria, and fusarium are probably more important. A big clue, though, should be very high IgE levels and nasty-looking CT scans, but you have to get tissue. I did a talk on exercise physiology in 1998. And he would have been 10 years old. Okay. And the upshot of this, and I think the most fascinating thing, is you say, well, I'm working out, I want to get a good shape. The reality is you get physically fit because of cardiovascular. You don't get physically fit because of your lungs. Your lungs are born with what you got, and you either have a good lung capacity or you don't. You can do damage to it by smoking. But as far as the adaptations to training for getting physically fit, it's mainly cardiac. You get cardiac hypertrophy, you get increased capillarization of the heart muscle, you increase your stroke volume, you lower your heart rate, and lower heart rate during submaximal workloads, and you have increased or improved heart recovery when you do exercise. on the other hand, the point I was making, with respiratory, you basically are born with what you got for lungs. Basically, your activity is unchanged pulmonary diffusion at rest and suboptimal exercise. If you really push the envelope, you can get some increased circulation, increased ventilation. But again, getting fit is mostly cardiovascular. Now, again, gotten way off the beaten track, Len assigned me the topic of stargazing. And a major point of this talk was to give an idea to go out to the night sky, and if you knew about 4 different constellations or prominent star groupings, you could identify about 80% of the major stars and constellations in the northern hemisphere. And if you know to where Orion, which is mostly out in the winter, or the Andromeda group, you remember it's got a W for Andromeda, the group, actually Cassiopeia is the W, excuse me. If you know where the North Pole is, and you can find the summer triangle, which is the 3 stars, Vega, Deneb, and Altair, you can identify most of the constellations and most of the major stars. The picture on the right showing the Castor and Pollux pointer there, it just kind of gives you an idea how you can line them up. Now going to the left slide, which is kind of crowded in there, shows that if you know the right part, you can identify all those other stars and constellations in the blue section there. If you just know where Orion's belt is and run everything out from there. Anyhow, in 2000, I did a talk on multiple drug allergy syndrome. At that time, there was a Sullivan. Is he still alive? He's down. He was down in Texas. Yeah. Was the primary mover on this. It was noted, and in our practice, we have patients that seem to have more allergies to things than anybody else. He said that 1 to 5% of patients had multiple drug allergy syndrome. You reacted to penicillin, you had 10 times the risk of reacting to other antibiotics. Admittedly, a lot of this is subjective, though. If your parents have it, then 15 times the risk in the kids, and if 10 times the chance if you have a family history. 2 times more likely in females, increased reaction to NSAIDs, and that Sullivan, in his papers at that time, estimated 50% of all antibiotic allergies were in these patients. Now, again, a lot of this was subjective, and I think a lot of this has to do with people that think they're going to get a drug reaction, and then report it to the allergist, and a lot of this is without clear documentation or challenges. In fact, if you go on the American Academy of Allergy website, they don't call it multiple drug allergy syndrome, they call it multiple drug intolerance syndrome now. Back to basic science again on cosmology. Again, I did this topic again, and I'll come back to it later. Then I got the topic of immunoglobulin D, and what is it good for at that time? There was a debate whether you should be measuring immunoglobulin D levels. And to make a long story short, the answer was, at least at that time, probably still is no. Anyhow, this describes some of it similar to IgG. It's in microscopic amounts. It has short half-life. The question is, what is its function? And about the only thing I really found, even today, let alone back then, is that it has something to do with B cell maturation, that when the IgM and IgD are exposed, the cell is mature and ready to respond to antigen. But once it does, then it's shed from the surface and it's gone. The one other thing I had forgotten about, you guys remember hyper-IgD syndrome? Okay, it's one of the periodic fevers. And back then when I did this talk, I'd forgotten that they had listed that as well as something that is associated with immunoglobulin D. Now, this is
Peyton or your previous dog.
Oh, that's right. I got to do justice. That is Mikey. Mikey, that's my previous dog. Brings a tear to my eye every time I see him. That's why I probably ignored him. No, he was a nice-looking dog, wasn't he? Okay. Now we're really getting off the beaten path. Len gave me wine and winemaking, and title is Why Not? The older guys here know that a lot of the allergists in the past were into winemaking. Warren Bierman and Pearson and Stan Seitz and Rick Johnson, and I got going along with them. I've been doing it since 1983. So anyhow, this was basically a talk on wine and winemaking, and to give you guys a little sophistication, because you guys can use it when you go out to a restaurant to know what to order, okay? But the other thing is I did look at the health benefits of wine. And they are considerable. There's lots of data, and this is the key word is moderation, that there are significant health benefits, at least from epidemiologic studies. That doesn't prove cause and effect. And, you know, it definitely can rate HDLs, but I think the major reason that people are likely to live longer, be more successful, less likely to get Alzheimer's, less likely to get a whole bunch of cancers, less likely to have heart disease, is not so much the wine. I think it's the lifestyle of the people. And if the lifestyle wine drinkers in this just slide tend to eat better, more fruits and vegetables, have less cholesterol and saturated fats, less red meat, more fowl and fish, tend to have a higher IQ, higher socioeconomic status, more likely to exercise and less likely to smoke. And I think that's probably more important than the alcohol per se. But there's a significant evidence. I got one more talk and I'll mention it. I did briefly mention Rick Johnson, and he was a mainstay of the allergy community. He was a Renaissance man. He had a great sense of humor. Everybody liked him. He was active in all the societies. He was the president of State Medical Association. He even got me to join the AMA, and so I've been paying those damn dues all these years. But anyhow, he was a winemaker. He was my partner. It'd be remiss if we don't remember him. He was a great addition to the allergy community. Now, even further off the beaten path, I don't know how many of you read the Da Vinci Code or saw the movie. That was a hot item in that year in 2004, and the movie was going to come out, and it was to be a blockbuster movie. Tom Hanks was in it. I'm forgetting the director, Opie. Ron Howard. Yeah. Was in it. And the basic premise of it, which was blasphemy to organized religion, was that Jesus Christ was mortal. He was married to Mary Magdalene. They had a child, and the child's descendants persisted to the present. And they made a big old story around it. But that was obviously the blasphemy part, is that Jesus was a human, and he had offspring, and Mary Magdalene was his wife. But actually, it's a good movie, and it was it made $750 million, and it made this guy very famous, and he uses the same kind of style of a book, and has made a lot of money doing it. Now, this was probably the worst talk in the history of Journal Club. My talk on chlamydia and mycoplasma. Anyhow, what this shows is this is the handout I did, and I must have gone over 30 different studies, looking at just going over data after data after data. And about 2/3 of the way through there, Len stopped me and said, "Is there a punchline to this?" And it's a little bit like this Gary Larson cartoon. As I'm talking, and I'm sure that was you on the bottom didn't like the dog. Anyhow, so I finally, I did have a summary slide for Len at that time. This was it. My Gestalto. The question was, do chlamydia and mycoplasma cause asthma? That was the question. My Gestalto was that acute infections with chlamydia and mycoplasma do increase asthma exacerbations, just like any viral illnesses, but are probably a minority, less than 10% based on the studies. I doubt that either are causes of asthma, but the chronic infection, especially with chlamydia, may lead to increased severity of asthma. And individuals who already have asthma could benefit with antibiotics, and that's popular. The guys at National Jewish often treat their patients with erythromycin-type antibiotics, Martin especially. And there may be a place for that. So that was after all was said and done.
This was a hot topic at the national meeting at the time. Every year there'd be presentations about chlamydia and mycoplasma and its role in asthma. We don't see it anymore.
Yeah, you don't see much. I admit I've not ever jumped on that bandwagon. Maybe I should have and tried on some of the difficult asthmatics. But
it still floats around in the rheumatology literature today about mycoplasma and rheumatoid arthritis. It's not done there.
Yeah, and that's been going on for decades, too. Anyhow, give me the topic of Krakatoa. Simon Winchester's book on Krakatoa had just come out. The interesting thing about Krakatoa, it was the first time a major disaster of that magnitude was promulgated in real time because they had just laid the cables across all the oceans. So they could tell the people in England, and they would get the information in hours about this. But Krakatoa, obviously, it's an island off the coast of Java, and it blew. And it killed about 40,000 people, mainly with tsunami. It could be heard 3,000 miles away, and it lowered temperatures in the Earth for the next 3 years, several degrees. It made for beautiful sunsets, too. The major, though, thing that I took from this, though, was the whole thing about volcanic activity. And the hot topic then, and still is plate tectonics. So I kind of went off on a tangent and discussed that in detail. Next one, moving on, is headaches for dummies. The take-home, what I was really looking for on this talk was how much does allergy play a role in headaches? And to be honest with you, there was very little information to support that. You know, a lot of people say I got food allergies and that's giving me headaches and migraines. And if you look at the literature, there's very little there to support that. Similarly, that most people have so-called sinus headaches that has nothing to do with sinuses. Most sinus headaches are tension headaches just because they're in this, or vascular headaches just because they're in the area of the base and around the sinuses. People assume, the lay public assumes, TV advertising assumes, well, it must be due to sinuses. Well, it's almost 25 years that I've been doing journal clubs, and it was time to honor Len for doing all the work for that. And actually the whole group did honored him one evening in 2007. David Letterman and I gave at that time, and they still apply now, the 10 reasons to honor and admire Len for being the godfather of Journal Club. Number 10, for becoming the first internist, non-pediatrician at Northwest Allergy and Asthma, and being the first allergist over 5'6". All these docs were little; they were about the same size as their patients over there. And before that, they had just seen mostly pediatrics at that time. Number 9, for having such bright kids, one of them is here, that his generosity and support of the Ivy League and Stanford University will keep these impoverished institutions solvent for the next 10 years. Number 8, for having the foresight to postpone childbirth so he can be both father and grandfather. Now, and this is probably the most important thing. You know, I've had a bad influence on most things, but this is the one positive influence I've had on my life. After eating a Dick's hamburger and having a near-death experience, he went from Pillsbury Doughboy, he was pudgy, to Dipides by becoming a fanatic runner. And he lost about 30, 40 pounds and became very fit.
Yeah, I owe you that for the rest of my
we
life.
went out running all the time. So, number 6, for bringing open-minded, intellectual sophistication to our journal club and to many individuals that desperately need it with such topics as the Da Vinci Code, Krakatoa, the Big Bang, and winemaking for dummies by one exceptional speaker. For his brilliant leadership in leading community allergists through the quagmire of formaldehyde-induced brain injury, multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome, pseudoporphyria, toxic mold, and at that time there was controversy about intradermal testing for inhalants. For inspiring with his true to life Horatio Alger story of how the only child of a Jewish dentist from the Queens marries a Catholic farm girl from Kansas and ends up buying a Bentley and then a Maserati. And now you're in Alvin Romero, right?
Now, one correction here. Of the 5 boroughs in New York, the only one that's is the Bronx.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, there's
it's
no
not the
Queens.
Queens.
I don't know why it was just the Bronx. There are only 4 places in the world that it's the Vatican, the Bronx. What are the other 2? The Hague. There's one other.
Chicago Bears, the Bears.
Huh?
The Bears.
At the end of the talk, somebody remember the other places.
Number 3, for educating even uneducable old farts, such as Rick Johnson, God rest his soul, Stan Zeitz, Nick Minotti, and I have to add, and now me. Personally, I wanted to thank him at that time. I still want to thank him for being my mentor and friend and making me what I am today, an average aging allergist.
Good play.
Anyhow, in all seriousness, now we got to get serious. For more than 25 years of dedication, and of course it's now like 40-something now, years of dedication to maintaining the camaraderie of the community allergists while promoting high standards of academic excellence, and most importantly, for being just an all-around nice guy. And at that time, there were the light beer ads that said, "I love you, man." Because, you know, so anyhow, I want to thank Glenn for all these years, and we need to do something soon as well. Anyhow, he gave me another topic, not just just a little bit of English literature, all of it. I did the complete history of all of the books. Yeah, and this slide kind of shows everything I covered. Although the one name that's missing there is Thomas Hardy, and I am a Thomas Hardy pup. And if you haven't read Tessa Dupervilles or Jude the Obscure, Mayor Casterbridge, you guys are missing great literature.
I still have your handout from that.
It was very thorough. It is a work ethic.
People would say at the end of a year, like we'd go through a year, the only talk they would remember would be Gary's talk. The scientific talk nobody remembers.
Science is hard to remember.
Yeah.
Anyhow, this is coming back. I did the complete history of the Earth in 1 hour for the press. And started right from the beginning, the origin of the universe and the planets and how the moon arrived, bringing it all the way up to the present. There's Mikey again. He's got the tennis ball in his mouth there. And I also, it's geology on the formation and distribution of rocks and minerals, which I thought was very fascinating. And so I discussed that. In fact, Drew and I wanted to test it out, so we went and hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon that year to check out all the sedimentary rock layers. But also in that talk, I didn't just do geology and the evolution of the Earth. I did the evolution of life in the same talk, starting with prokaryotes, going to plants and fish, et cetera, and getting all the way to hominids. And that 6 million years ago, they found the Ardipithecus, or actually that's not right, 4.4 million years ago. Here's a picture of Ardipithecus, and you've seen since 4.4 million years ago, we haven't come very far.
I remember that slide.
He gave me the topic Einstein's Brain because it was a book that came out. That is Einstein's Brain in that jar there. So there was a book about it. Einstein died on my birthday in 1955. At the age of 76, he had a ruptured aortic aneurysm. A pathologist handled his brain right away and cut it into 240 pieces, soaked it in formalin, and he put it in mason jars after that. And they were looking, obviously, to see if there's some anatomical basis for why this guy is so brilliant and so far above anybody else from an intellectual point of view. And the upshot is they did find some subtle things, like no parietal operculum, and an enlarged sylvian fissure, and a larger inferior parietal lobe, and a smaller than average, but he did have a smaller than average sized brain, and he had neurofibrillary tangles suggesting he's getting early Alzheimer's. So the upshot was there really wasn't anything that distinguished the brain. Those are minor issues. So that was about it from that book. So I went off from that just to review neuroanatomy and disease states, and this talks about pathology in the brain that had been investigated at that time and found at least cogent arguments for why individuals have these syndromes. For example, on ADHD, or so-called reward deficiency syndrome, there's decreased dopamine. Okay, with OCD, you get blocking of the neural circuits from the basal ganglia to the cingulate gyrus. So they're coming along. Tourette's, I think I learned this in medical school, involves the caudate nucleus. Alzheimer's involves the hippocampus, where it's atrophies, and that's what incorporates memory, and of course they lose that. Addiction behavior have decreased dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. With autism, there are excess of neurons in the hippocampus, amygdala, with overprocessing in the frontal and temporal lobes. That's why they can't handle a lot of input. And lastly, antisocial behavior is related to underactive frontal lobes, at least by PET scans. And of course, Len's picture there has nothing to do with it. That's all. Anyhow, coming back to the universe and cosmology, the big thing was where is all the matter? Only about 5% is visible, and they couldn't find out where the rest of the matter is. But even more importantly, the much bigger development was this energy that occupies the universe that nobody realized existed until we found out the universe was expanding. And what this information from this talk came up is we basically know the fate of what's going to happen to the universe now. Space is being stretched out in distant areas. It is even moving faster than the speed of light. And I didn't think anything would move faster than the speed of light. So you can create more spaces that enlarges. You create more vacuum energy, which accelerates the expansion. The dark energy dominated gravity at about 5 billion years ago. It was actually slowing down the expansion of the universe, but then at 5 billion years ago, it started speeding up. And the dark energy has induced overwhelming expansion, and the universe will disintegrate. We will not go back to a big crunch. There is not enough gravity, and there's too much energy to prevent the universe from closing back on itself.
Is the first statement true? Is there really anything that moves faster than the speed
That's
of
what
light?
they said. They're saying that space can, and I don't know.
I don't know.
That's perplexing. Then I had religion. Let me see how I'm doing. Religion for the internists. And here I'll do my last quiz here, and we'll do it quickly. I focus mostly on non-Christianity, but all right. You guys remember what Kumbh Mela is?
Whoever knew.
We don't have any East Indians here, huh? Anyhow, it's the largest pilgrimage in the world, hundreds of millions in India. It's every 3 years. A bindi is the little chakra spot that East Indians put on their forehead. Oh boy, I'm going to Tanuk. I'm going to skip by this out. The Tanuk, you know what that is? That's those Jewish laws. Halal is equivalent of kosher. Ki is the energy in, I think it's Taoism. The study of salvation is soterology, the bottom one. Confuzi, you know what that is? Confucius, that's his name. And they just, mitzvah. What's a mitzvah?
This was a Jewish greeting, a good greeting, a good...
Mudras are the hand symbols that in Hinduism. The way is Taoism. Torii shrines are those kind of look like a big pie sign with the gates to go into Shinto sacred spots. Golden Temple is with famous or the most holy place. It's in India in Sikh religion. Shiites are all descendants of Muhammad's daughter Fatima. And an avatar is a presence on the earth of a god form, and the classic is Krishna. Right? Blocking a bodhisattva. Okay. Anyhow, what happened also in 2013 is I became a grandfather for the first time. Actually, I conflated things. On the right is my granddaughter. She's 3.5. And actually, that's not true. She's 4.5. And here she's a budding violinist now. And my grandson is 1.5 years old, and that's who Drew and I are holding. Proud grandfather and proud dad. Next thing, Spillover was a popular book back in 2013. Len had me review it. And to move quickly, because I want to get to the last slide, it talks about how animal infections jump to humans. Probably 2/3 of all our infections were in animals first and then jumped to us anyway. So there are lots of cases. But just to go through all these, and most of them are exotic, and a lot of them are very deadly, from Machupo virus to Lassa fever to Ebola, HIV-1, and a lesser form of HIV, HIV-2. The hantaviruses, I already talked about it. The Hendra viruses, where people in Australia on ranches were dying. By the way, a lot of these infections are carried by bats. Avian flu, of course, was a jump from birds to humans. The Nipah virus was Malaysian pig farmers. West Nile is old, but what was bad in 1999 spread to the U.S., and now we've got all the microcephaly cases in pregnant women. 2003 was SARS. I remember being in Toronto and killing a bunch of people up there. There's other syndromes you probably never heard of, like severe fever and thrombocytopenia syndrome. MERS, or the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, is seen in the Middle East, and worry about travelers.
Was the severe fever, was that when they killed all the chickens in China because they thought it was spread by chickens?
Yes. Well, that was the influenza one. That's just bird flu. That bird. Anyhow, but the most severe and epidemic one is bugaboo fever. Have you heard of that? It's primarily seen in elderly skiers. There's a picture of a couple there. Its geographic location is the western Canadian Rockies, the animal reservoir of the powder hounds. It is associated with early onset senility, reflected by being foolish enough to pay $1,000 a day to ski. The symptoms are myalgias, chilblains, and hangovers. Central nervous system symptoms of delusions of grandeur, ecstatic, childlike frivolity when skiing waist-deep powder, and inappropriate behavior. That's Chuck with some beautiful woman there. Anyhow, back to cosmology, and I'm getting close, and I think I'll be okay. My first talk on this was 1988, but I want to show you all the things that have been found since '88, so these developments are coming on fast. We now know the fate of the universe, didn't before. It is expanding, as I just discussed. The tau neutrino and the top quark were both discovered. The Higgs particle is proven to exist, and the Higgs particle gives mass to all particles. Gravity waves were detected experimentally in 2015, and this state was part of the discovery. Finally got the age of the universe down to fractions. Dark energy was discovered in 1998. The cosmic background radiation from the Big Bang, which proves the existence of the Big Bang, was discovered. And we are finding many exoplanets, or small planets, for potential for human life in other areas. So, with all the new physics and all those three talks, we know about the creation of the universe, the fate of the universe, the origin of matter, the fate of matter, the relationship of matter and energy, equals mc squared. And in other words, we basically know everything about what's going to happen. So now it's time to go back drinking again. And I did another one, Wine and Health. And here was a summary statement. I know a lot of people probably contend this one. Alcohol in moderation appears to have more benefit in heart disease than diet, lowering cholesterol, treating hypertension, or exercise. Only smoking cessation has greater impact. And alcohol prevents more deaths than its abuse cause. Here's an example of people trying to improve their health. Drew and his wife and Wendy in the middle there. Anyhow, I always threw this slide in because I think it's one of the most spectacular slides. It has absolutely nothing to do with the talk. But the look of those animals are magnificent creatures. Now, finish up.
Oh, no.
My last talk was about extraterrestrial medicine and the future of our planet and looking for life in other places. And I finished up with a slide of Home Sweet Home and what is the future when we've got a bunch of megalomaniacs in this world. Anyhow, that's not the important future. The important future is this. The future of germ club. What's going to happen? The truth of the matter is Len can't do this forever. I don't doubt it'll go another 20 years, don't get me wrong. But we need some new young blood to take over. It is a high maintenance and no pay job. It is a labor of love, and you have to be like Len and really love what you're doing. You also be like Len, and you need chutzpah to get speakers and funding from pharma. I do think it can only remain viable if enough in-person physician attendees come. And admittedly, here we got Paul and Al and Bill and Mike, Pandora. There she is. But the older attendees are starting to fade away like old soldiers. So we need the new young blood with a passion for learning and leading the allergy community. And the big question I was going to raise, and I'd like some input if anybody has any, is who will lead us to the promised land because somebody needs to help out Len or take over his job. Nobody can do it. In that same line, I think, and I hope, I think there's certainly the talent out here and enthusiasm. We can get somebody to do it. But the other thing is, although Paul Van Arzo is a great guy, and he got this named after him posthumously, however you say it, I would rather do that before Len dies. And I think it should definitely be named after him now, and maybe I could vote on it our next meeting. But at any rate, I do think we all need to scratch our heads and see what we can do to keep the future of this incredible project that he's been the mastermind of for the last 40-something years. So I want to thank Len.